My right hand shook violently against the cold steel tray. The stainless steel forceps clattered, a pathetic, rhythmic ringing that echoed off the pristine white ceramic tiles of the hyperbaric chamber room. I stared at my own fingers, watching the deliberate, chaotic spasm. It was a masterpiece of muscular control, a calculated biological metronome. To the untrained eye, it was the tragic aftermath of a nervous breakdown. To me, it was a cloak of absolute invisibility. I focused on the vibration, letting the tremor travel up my forearm, keeping the frequency erratic but constant. It required an immense amount of physical stamina to maintain the illusion. The lactic acid burned in my muscles. The tendons in my wrist ached with a dull, persistent throb, but I could not stop. I had been shaking for 14 hours a day, every day, for the past 2 months. Gareth sighed, a wet, heavy sound of pure disgust. He leaned against the reinforced glass of the primary pressure chamber, his tailored navy scrubs perfectly pressed, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a concierge physician, a man who had traded the grueling nobility of emergency medicine for the lucrative comfort of pandering to billionaires. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale coffee. "Are you quite finished, Blythe?" Gareth asked. His voice was smooth, dripping with an elitist condescension that made my jaw tighten. "Because if you cannot manage to organize a simple surgical tray without vibrating like a faulty centrifuge, I will have Silas reassign you to laundry duty. It is frankly pathetic." I lowered my head, letting my shoulders slump inward. I reached up with my left hand, the steady one, and pushed my thick prescription glasses higher up the bridge of my nose. The lenses were heavily curved, distorting my peripheral vision, forcing me to turn my entire head to track movement. It was a necessary sacrifice. The glasses made my eyes look wide, watery, and perpetually frightened. I mumbled a breathless apology, staring at the floor. I let my voice waver, pitching it half an octave higher than my natural tone. I told him I was sorry, that my medication was wearing off, that I would be faster. I am an Interpol medical auditor. I am a former tactical field medic who has pulled shrapnel from femoral arteries in the back of burning transport trucks in war zones that do not exist on official maps. But Gareth did not know that. No one on this island knew that. To them, I was just Blythe, the fragile, disgraced nurse who had shattered under the pressure of a city hospital trauma ward, the broken woman who was grateful to hide in the shadows of this remote facility. Gareth scoffed, pushing himself off the glass. He told me to clean up the mess and get out of his sight. I listened to the soft squeak of his expensive medical clogs as he walked down the hallway, leaving me alone in the humming silence of the chamber room. I stopped shaking. Instantly, my hand went dead still. I picked up the forceps with absolute, surgical precision and placed them silently onto the sterile field. I took a deep, slow breath, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. The clinic was a fortress disguised as a sanctuary. It sat on a jagged, storm-swept island off the coast of Maine, a brutal slab of granite jutting out of the freezing Atlantic Ocean. The brochure promised absolute discretion. It promised state-of-the-art hyperbaric chambers, concierge psychiatric care, and bespoke longevity treatments for those who could afford the astronomical price tag. The clientele were ghosts of the upper echelon, disgraced politicians hiding from public indictments, tech billionaires obsessed with outrunning their own mortality, aging oligarchs seeking cellular rejuvenation. They came here to be pampered. They came here to buy time. But time is not manufactured in a laboratory. It is stolen from someone else. I spent my days shuffling through the pristine, icy corridors, my head down, my right hand trembling whenever a supervisor walked past. The clinic was terrifyingly quiet. The floors were a seamless poured epoxy that absorbed the sound of footsteps, making everyone move like phantoms. The walls were painted in soothing, clinical tones of slate and seafoam. It smelled of ozone, medical-grade bleach, and the faint, metallic tang of money. The real horror of the facility was hidden beneath the veneer of wellness. I was sent here to find the proof. Interpol had intercepted whispers of a black market organ trafficking ring operating out of the North Atlantic, a syndicate that catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, providing immediate, unlisted transplants without the inconvenience of a national donor waiting list. It happened on a Tuesday, during the graveyard shift. The wind outside was already beginning to howl, the leading edge of a massive weather system churning up the coast. The barometric pressure was dropping rapidly, making the heavy security doors groan in their frames. I was at the intake station in the emergency receiving bay, pretending to struggle with a stack of digital patient files. Juliet was sitting beside me. She was a concierge intake nurse, hired for her warm smile and her ability to make arrogant men feel important. She was young, empathetic, and entirely out of her depth. She did not belong in a place like this. She was terrified of the wealthy clientele, and even more terrified of the aggressive security staff that roamed the perimeter. The heavy pneumatic doors of the receiving bay hissed open. The sound was a violent intrusion in the silent clinic. Juliet jumped, her hand flying to her throat. I kept my eyes on my screen, but I shifted my weight, my muscles instantly coiling with tactical readiness beneath my oversized scrubs. Cale walked in first. He was the head of island security, a former private military contractor who moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of a predator. He smelled of freezing rain and cold sweat. His tactical boots left wet tracks on the pristine epoxy floor. He did not wear a uniform, just dark tactical clothing and a heavy utility belt that held a collapsible baton and a sidearm. Behind him, two of his heavily armed contractors were dragging a man. It was Victor. I recognized him immediately from the VIP dossier I had memorized before deployment. He was a tech billionaire who had checked in 3 weeks ago for a routine course of hyperbaric oxygen therapy and cellular rejuvenation. But he did not look rejuvenated. He looked like a corpse. His skin was the color of wet ash. His head lolled forward, his chin resting on his chest, his eyes rolled back in his skull. He was heavily sedated, completely unresponsive, his bare feet dragging across the floor. As they hauled him past the intake desk, his silk pajama top slipped open. I saw it, a fresh surgical incision on his lower left flank. It was angry, red, and leaking a steady stream of dark blood down his side. It was not a healing wound. It was a hasty, brutal cut, closed with sloppy, uneven sutures. Darius stepped through the doors behind them. He was the chief medical officer, the architect of this nightmare. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, a cashmere overcoat draped over his shoulders despite the late hour. He was charismatic, brilliant, and utterly devoid of a human conscience. He viewed human life as a collection of spare parts, a biological inventory waiting to be liquidated to the highest bidder. Darius leaned over the intake desk. His cologne was sharp, smelling of bergamot and cedar. He looked at Juliet, his eyes flat and dead. "This admission does not exist," he whispered, his voice a smooth, terrifying purr. "Keep him off the official digital ledger. Do not log his vitals into the mainframe. Page Dr. Rowan to the private surgical suite. Now." Before Juliet could even reach for the communications panel, the alarms on Victor's portable transport monitor began to scream, a high-pitched, frantic warning that shattered the quiet of the bay. His blood pressure was plummeting. The numbers on the digital display flashed red. His heart rate was erratic, spiking wildly and then dropping into dangerous bradycardia. He was crashing. He was bleeding out internally from whatever butcher job they had performed on him in the sub-basement. Juliet froze. Total cognitive paralysis. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, her eyes wide with panic. She looked at the monitor, then at the blood pooling on the floor beneath Victor, unable to process the trauma unfolding in front of her. Cale cursed, stepping forward, his hand dropping to the tactical baton on his belt. "Fix him," Cale barked at Juliet, his voice echoing off the tile walls. "Do something, you stupid girl." I did not think. I moved. I pushed my chair back, the wheels squeaking loudly against the floor. I stumbled forward, playing the clumsy, frightened nurse, but my trajectory was flawless. I reached the crash cart before Cale could even blink. I grabbed a central line kit, tearing the sterile packaging open with my teeth. I needed to establish deep venous access, and I needed to do it in seconds. I looked down at my right hand. The tremor was gone. I had suppressed it, locking my muscles into a state of absolute, icy stillness. I grabbed a bottle of iodine, swiping it aggressively across Victor's collarbone. I did not wait for it to dry. I found the anatomical landmarks by touch, my fingers pressing deep into his cold, clammy skin. I felt the faint, thready pulse of his carotid artery. I moved 1 inch lateral, the internal jugular vein. I uncapped the large bore needle. I did not use the ultrasound guide. There was no time to boot the machine. I relied on muscle memory, on the thousands of times I had done this in the mud and the blood of a combat zone. I angled the needle, feeling the slight resistance of the skin, the pop of the fascia, and then the smooth, frictionless slide into the vein. I pulled back on the plunger. A flash of dark, deoxygenated blood filled the syringe. Perfect placement. I threaded the guide wire through the needle, my hands moving with a fluid, blinding speed. I removed the needle, slid the heavy plastic catheter over the wire, locked it in place, and attached a bag of rapid infuser saline. I opened the valve wide, letting the fluids rush into his collapsing circulatory system. Victor's monitor gave a steady, reassuring beep. As his blood pressure slowly began to stabilize, the red flashing numbers turned back to a calm, steady green. I exhaled, a short, sharp breath, and then I looked up. Helena was standing in the doorway of the receiving bay. She was the lead transplant surgeon. She was brilliant, uncompromising, and entirely focused on patient care. She had arrived just in time to watch me work. She had seen the speed, she had seen the tactical precision, and most importantly, she had seen my hands. They were perfectly, unnervingly steady. Panic, real, cold panic, flared in my chest. I immediately released the muscular lock. My right hand began to shake violently, the tremor returning with a vengeance. I dropped the bloody syringe onto the floor, letting it shatter against the tiles. I gasped, taking a clumsy step back, my shoulders hunching up to my ears. I looked at Helena through my thick, distorting glasses, my eyes wide and terrified. I grabbed my right wrist with my left hand, as if trying to physically restrain the tremor, whimpering softly. Helena did not say a word. She walked past me, her eyes locked on my face for one long, agonizing second. She looked at the perfectly placed central line, the textbook execution of an advanced trauma procedure, and then back at my shaking hands. She knew. She did not know what I was, but she knew I was a liar. She turned her attention to Victor, barking orders at the security contractors to move him to the private suite immediately. I backed away, melting into the shadows of the corridor, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had exposed myself, but Victor was alive. For now, over the next 3 weeks, I turned the clinic into my own private chessboard. I mapped every square inch of the facility. I counted the exact number of steps between the security cameras. I memorized the blind spots in the laundry corridors and the ventilation shafts. I learned the shift rotations of Kale's private military contractors, noting when they took their smoke breaks and when they were most fatigued. I knew exactly how long it took for the magnetic locks on the heavy security doors to engage and disengage, 3.2 seconds. A lifetime in a tactical situation. My primary target was Silas. He was the clinic's logistics and admissions coordinator. He was a small, nervous man who sweated profusely and constantly chewed on the inside of his cheek. He was the weak link in Darius's empire. He was the man who managed the data, and data always leaves a trail. I began to access the secondary computer terminals in the empty patient rooms during my night shifts. I cross-referenced the official longevity treatment schedules with the internal pharmacy requisitions. The numbers did not match. The clinic was ordering massive quantities of heavy-duty immunosuppressants, tacrolimus, cyclosporin, mycophenolate. These were not drugs you used for cellular rejuvenation or vitamin drips. These were anti-rejection medications. You only needed these if you were putting foreign organs into a human body. I needed access to Silas's primary terminal in his locked office. I needed a distraction to get past the security desk in the administrative wing. Gareth provided it. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The clinic was bustling with the quiet, hushed activity of the wealthy receiving their afternoon treatments. I was carrying a heavy stack of physical patient charts down the main corridor, my right hand trembling violently against the plastic folders. Gareth stepped out of a private suite, looking at his phone. He intentionally bumped his shoulder against mine, a hard, aggressive shove. The charts spilled across the floor, a cascade of white paper and plastic folders sliding across the polished epoxy. I dropped to my knees, my right hand shaking uncontrollably as I tried to gather them. Gareth stood over me, his hands on his hips, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "You clumsy, incompetent fool," Gareth hissed, his voice echoing down the hallway. Several nurses and a passing security contractor stopped to watch. "Look at you. You are a liability. You belong in a psychiatric ward, Blythe, not a medical facility. You are a pathetic excuse for a nurse." I let the tears come. It was easy to cry. I just thought about the people who had died on this island. I thought about Victor, bleeding out in the middle of the night, treated like a piece of meat. The tears spilled over my thick glasses, tracking down my cheeks. I let out a ragged, humiliating sob. I stood up, leaving the charts scattered on the floor, and ran down the hallway, my hands covering my face, playing the absolute victim. I ran straight toward the administrative wing. I knew Silas was in the cafeteria for his strictly scheduled 30-minute lunch break. I reached his office door. I dropped my hands from my face. The tears stopped instantly. My breathing slowed to a calm, measured rhythm. I pulled a small titanium tension wrench and a diamond-tipped lockpick from the lining of my oversized scrubs. I knelt by the door, inserting the tools into the heavy biometric override cylinder. I closed my eyes, feeling the microscopic pins inside the lock. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A soft, satisfying click echoed in the empty hallway. I turned the handle and slipped inside, closing the door silently behind me. The office was dark, illuminated only by the glow of Silas's dual monitors. I sat at his desk, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I bypassed his rudimentary password protection in seconds using a brute force decryption drive hidden in a flash drive. I opened the hidden directories. There it was, the truth. Silas was falsifying the blood typing records and the tissue match databases. He was taking the genetic profiles of the wealthy clients who came for longevity treatments and cross-referencing them with the profiles of the vulnerable, isolated patients who were brought in under the guise of psychiatric care. He was creating a catalog, a menu of human spare parts. I dug deeper into the encrypted files. I found the altered centrifuge calibration logs. The massive medical centrifuges in the sub-basement laboratory were not being used to spin down plasma for facial injections. They were being calibrated to preserve harvested organs for transport: hearts, livers, kidneys. The clinic was a slaughterhouse wrapped in a 5-star resort. I memorized the IP addresses, the encrypted routing numbers, and the aliases of the buyers. I slipped out of the office, locking the door behind me, and made my way to the empty cardiology wing on the 3rd floor. I wheeled a heavy, outdated EKG machine into a dark supply closet. I unscrewed the back panel of the machine, exposing the complex wiring board. I pulled a small, modified data transmitter from my pocket and spliced it directly into the telemetry feed. I typed the data I had stolen from Silas into a hidden interface on my transmitter. I set the machine to broadcast. The data was compressed into encrypted microbursts, hidden within the rhythmic electrical spikes of a simulated human heartbeat. It was sent out over the clinic's secure medical network, bouncing off a communications satellite and landing directly on a secure server at Interpol headquarters in Lyon. The escalation began 2 days later. The atmosphere on the island began to change. The air grew heavy, thick with the static electricity of an approaching storm. The sky over the Atlantic bruised a deep, violent purple, blocking out the sun. The waves crashed against the granite cliffs with a deafening roar, sending plumes of freezing spray high into the air. I found Juliet hiding in the linen supply room. She was sitting on the floor, her knees pulled up to her chest, rocking back and forth among the stacks of folded towels. She was trembling, her face pale and drawn. I knelt beside her, keeping my hands perfectly still. "Juliet," I whispered, keeping my voice soft and steady. "What happened?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide with terror. "I was on the helipad," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind battering the exterior walls. "I was taking a smoke break before the storm hit. A helicopter landed. It was not one of ours. It was black, no markings, no tail numbers. A midnight charter, the illicit transport network. They only flew in bad weather, using the severe storms to mask their radar signature from the Coast Guard. Cale was there," Juliet continued, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He met the pilot. The pilot handed him a small black case. Cale opened it. I saw it, Blythe. It was an encrypted hard drive. A ledger." Cale looked up and saw me standing by the access door. Juliet rolled up the sleeve of her scrub top. A massive dark purple bruise was blooming in the shape of a large handprint on her bicep. The finger marks were clearly defined, pressed deep into her skin. "He grabbed me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He squeezed my arm so hard I thought the bone was going to snap. He leaned in and told me that curiosity is a fatal condition on this island. He said if I ever spoke about the helicopter, I would become a permanent resident of the sub-basement." I touched her shoulder gently. The anger flared inside me, a cold, bright flame of pure tactical rage. I buried it deep. Emotion was a luxury I could not afford right now. The hard drive meant the logistics were finalized. A buyer had transferred the funds. The tissue match was confirmed. The timeline was accelerating rapidly. They were going to harvest Victor tonight, before the storm cut them off completely. The nor'easter hit the island with the force of a bomb. It was a Category 3 storm. The wind howled like a dying animal, battering the reinforced glass of the clinic windows with relentless fury. The rain fell in horizontal sheets, turning the outside world into a swirling, impenetrable gray void. The internal communication system crackled to life. Silas's nervous, reedy voice echoed through the corridors. "Attention all staff. The Coast Guard has officially suspended all marine and air traffic in the sector. The island is under a strict lockdown protocol. No one is permitted to leave the facility." We were trapped. The island was completely isolated from the rest of the world. I was in the primary medical supply room, deep in the surgical wing. I was gathering the physical vials of the unlogged immunosuppressants, placing them into a sterile evidence bag. I needed physical proof to match the digital data I had transmitted. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, buzzed loudly, and died. The room plunged into absolute darkness. A second later, the emergency generators kicked in deep in the bowels of the clinic. The backup lights flickered on, bathing the corridors in a sickly, dim red glow. The hum of the main ventilation system ground to a halt, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of the isolated facility. This was not a weather-related outage. The clinic had triple redundant power grids designed to withstand a hurricane. Kale had intentionally cut the main feed. He was blinding the internal security cameras. The extraction team was moving. I zipped the evidence bag shut and turned toward the door. The heavy pneumatic panel slid open. Darius stood in the doorway. He was silhouetted against the red emergency lights of the hallway. He looked perfectly calm, his hands resting in the pockets of his tailored trousers. He did not look at me with the usual dismissive arrogance. He looked at me with a cold, calculating intensity. He saw a problem. "Blythe," Darius said, his voice smooth and unhurried, cutting through the sound of the storm outside. "You are working late, admiring the inventory." He stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the shelves of medical supplies. "It is a funny thing about data, Blythe. It leaves a footprint. Silas informed me that someone has been accessing the centrifuge calibration logs, someone with a very specific interest in our preservation protocols." I backed away, my right hand beginning to shake violently. I pushed my thick glasses up my nose, letting my breathing become shallow and panicked. "I do not know what you mean, Dr. Darius," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I was just organizing the saline." Darius smiled. It was a terrifying, empty expression. "Of course you were," he whispered. He stepped backward, out into the red-lit hallway. "Stay here, Blythe. The storm is quite dangerous. I would hate for you to get hurt." He reached out and hit the manual override switch on the wall panel. The heavy steel door slid shut with a vitance. The magnetic locks engaged with a loud, definitive clack. I was trapped in the dark, and somewhere in the VIP ward, Kale and his extraction team were moving in to harvest Victor. I was trapped in the dark, and somewhere in the VIP ward, Kale and his extraction team were moving in to harvest Victor. But I was not alone in the supply room. The heavy steel door had sealed out the red emergency lights of the corridor. The room was plunged into a suffocating pitch-black silence, broken only by the muffled, rhythmic pounding of the storm against the exterior walls. Then, the internal backup lights flickered to life. They cast a sickly, pale green illumination across the rows of stainless steel shelving. Two massive shapes detached themselves from the shadows near the rear loading bay. They were private military contractors. Kale had left them behind. They wore dark tactical gear, heavy ceramic plate carriers, and drop-leg holsters. They moved with the relaxed, predatory confidence of men who were used to absolute authority. One of them chuckled. It was a low, cruel sound that vibrated in the tight space. He stepped forward, unholstering a heavy, suppressed sidearm. He did not point it at me yet. He just let it hang by his side, a casual display of lethal intent. "Dr. Darius said you might need some company," the contractor said. His voice was thick with amusement. "He said you have a nervous disposition and should not be left alone in the dark." I looked down at my right hand. It was shaking violently. The tremor was so severe that my fingers were a blur of panicked motion against my scrub top. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper. I backed up against a heavy cart loaded with pressurized medical gas cylinders. I hunched my shoulders, making myself look as small and fragile as possible. The second contractor stepped into the pale green light. He was holding a heavy tactical baton, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. "Look at her," the second man said. "She is vibrating like a terrified rabbit. This is going to be entirely too easy." I reached up with my left hand. My fingers brushed against the thick, heavy frames of my prescription glasses. I pulled them off my face. I let them drop to the poured epoxy floor. The heavy, distorting lenses shattered with a sharp, crystalline crunch, that echoed in the quiet room. I closed my eyes and took one deep, slow breath. I let the cold air fill my lungs, feeling the oxygen saturate my bloodstream. I visualized the tension in my muscles, the calculated chaos of the tremor that I had maintained for 2 agonizing months. And then, I let it go. I opened my eyes. My vision, no longer distorted by the heavy glass, was razor sharp. The pale green light of the room snapped into perfect, high-definition clarity. I looked down at my right hand. It was dead still, not a single millimeter of movement. The biological metronome had stopped completely. The first contractor frowned. The amusement vanished from his face instantly. His tactical instincts, honed in whatever war zone Kale had recruited him from, registered the sudden, impossible shift in my physiology. He began to raise his suppressed weapon. He was fast, but he was operating on reaction. I was operating on anticipation. I did not hesitate. I did not flinch. I moved with a fluid, explosive violence that the cramped room could barely contain. My hand shot backward, gripping the heavy brass valve of a large liquid nitrogen canister secured to the cart behind me. I did not try to lift the massive tank. I simply ripped the primary release valve open and kicked the cart forward. A blinding, roaring cloud of sub-zero vapor erupted into the room. The pressurized nitrogen expanded instantly, filling the space between the shelving units with a thick, freezing white fog. The temperature in the room plummeted in a fraction of a second, the moisture in the air crystallizing into ice. The first contractor fired blindly into the vapor. The suppressed shot made a dull, heavy thwack, the bullet burying itself into a box of saline bags directly behind where I had been standing. But I was already gone. I had dropped to a low crouch, moving rapidly beneath the expanding cloud of freezing gas. I slid across the smooth epoxy floor, closing the distance between us in a heartbeat. I came up on his blind side, just as he was trying to wave the freezing vapor away from his face. I reached out and grabbed the heavy, portable defibrillator unit resting on the lower shelf beside him. It was an older model, heavy and dense, designed for emergency crash carts. I did not bother turning it on. I used it as a blunt force kinetic weapon. I swung the heavy plastic housing upward with every ounce of torque in my hips and shoulders. The solid edge of the defibrillator connected with the underside of his jaw. The impact was a sickening, wet crunch. The kinetic force snapped his head back with enough violence to instantly sever his consciousness. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The second contractor lunged through the dissipating nitrogen fog. He swung the heavy tactical baton in a brutal, downward arc aimed directly at my skull. I stepped inside his guard. I raised my left forearm, catching his wrist before the baton could gain terminal velocity. The impact bruised the bone, a sharp flare of pain, but I ignored it. With my right hand, I drove a rigid 2-finger strike directly into the soft tissue of his throat, crushing his trachea. He gagged, his eyes bulging in sudden, suffocating panic. He dropped the baton, his hands flying to his neck as he desperately tried to draw air into his collapsing airway. I did not give him the chance to recover. I grabbed the heavy ceramic collar of his plate carrier, pivoted on my heel, and used his own forward momentum to slam him face first into the reinforced steel door. He hit the metal with a heavy hollow thud and slid to the floor, completely incapacitated. The entire engagement had lasted less than 6 seconds. I stood in the pale green light, the freezing nitrogen vapor swirling around my ankles. The silence of the room returned, broken only by the ragged, wet breathing of the man on the floor. I reached down and picked up the suppressed sidearm dropped by the first contractor. It was a heavy, well-maintained tactical pistol. I checked the chamber, feeling the cold, precise mechanics of the weapon. I stepped over the bodies. I walked to the electronic keypad next to the heavy steel door. Darius had engaged the magnetic locks from the outside, but the internal emergency release was still active. I popped the plastic cover off the release panel, exposing the wiring. I used the heavy steel barrel of the pistol to smash the internal relay. The magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy clack. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the red-lit corridor. The clinic had transformed. It was no longer a pristine sanctuary of wellness. It was a dark, storm-battered labyrinth. The emergency lighting cast long, distorted shadows across the slate and seafoam walls. The wind outside howled with a deafening, relentless fury, shaking the very foundation of the island. I moved like a ghost through the empty hallways. I kept my footsteps perfectly silent, rolling my weight from heel to toe on the poured epoxy floors. I kept the suppressed pistol raised, my eyes scanning the intersecting corridors for any sign of Kale and his men. I needed to reach the main surgical suite. I needed to stop the harvest. But first I had to secure the loose ends. I moved through the administrative wing, checking the empty offices. The staff had scattered when the power went out, hiding in whatever dark corners they could find. I found Juliet in the radiology department. She was huddled beneath the heavy control console of the primary magnetic resonance imaging machine. The room was pitch black, save for the faint ambient glow of the storm raging outside the reinforced windows. She was crying softly, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. I stepped into the room, keeping my footsteps light. "Juliet," I whispered, keeping my voice low and calm. She gasped, scrambling backward until her back hit the wall. "Who is there?" she cried, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "It is Blythe," I said. I lowered the pistol, keeping it hidden behind my leg, and stepped into the faint light near the window. Juliet looked at me, her eyes wide and confused. She looked at my face, searching for the thick, distorting glasses. She looked at my hands, expecting to see the violent, pathetic tremor. She saw nothing but absolute stillness. "Blythe," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Your hands. You are not shaking." I knelt beside her. I looked directly into her eyes. The fragile, broken nurse was gone. I let her see the cold, tactical reality of who I was. "Listen to me very carefully, Juliet," I said, my voice steady and unhurried. "The men who run this clinic are currently executing a hostile medical extraction. The facility is compromised. You are in extreme danger." She stared at me, her mind struggling to process the sudden, impossible shift in my demeanor. "I need you to stand up," I commanded. "I need you to walk into the primary scanning room. The walls are lined with heavy copper shielding and reinforced lead to contain the magnetic field. It is the safest room on this island. You will lock the heavy acoustic door from the inside. You will not open it for anyone. Do you understand me?" Juliet swallowed hard. She looked at the cold, clinical authority in my eyes and she nodded slowly. "Yes," she whispered. "Go," I said. Now, I watched her scramble to her feet and run into the scanning room. I waited until I heard the heavy, airtight seal of the acoustic door lock into place. She was safe. I turned and moved back into the red-lit corridor, heading toward the VIP ward. The storm was reaching its peak. The building groaned under the immense barometric pressure. The sound of the wind was a constant, physical vibration in the floorboards. As I approached the intersection leading to the surgical wing, I heard a sound, a pathetic, wet sobbing coming from the doctor's lounge. I pushed the door open. Gareth was sitting on the floor, backed into a corner behind a heavy leather sofa. His expensive, tailored navy scrubs were torn and stained with blood. His face was bruised, his lips split open and bleeding freely down his chin. He had encountered Kale and his men. They had not treated the arrogant concierge physician with the respect he believed he deserved. They had simply beaten him out of their way. Gareth looked up as I entered the room. His eyes were wide with a primal, humiliating fear. He saw the silhouette of a person holding a weapon, and he cowered, raising his hands to protect his face. "Please," Gareth begged, his voice a high-pitched, reedy whine. "Please, I do not know anything. I am just a doctor. Do not hurt me." I stepped fully into the room, letting the red emergency lights illuminate my face. Gareth froze. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at me, his eyes tracking from my steady, unblinking gaze down to the heavy tactical pistol gripped loosely in my perfectly still right hand. "Blythe," he whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. I looked down at him. I looked at the man who had spent the last 2 months mocking my supposed weakness, the man who had humiliated me in the corridors, who had laughed at my tremor, who had mistaken my deliberate submissiveness for pathetic fragility. He was trembling. His hands were shaking violently against his chest. I did not feel anger. I did not feel vindication. I only felt a cold, clinical pity. "You are shaking, Dr. Gareth," I said. My voice was quiet, echoing in the dark room. He looked at his own hands, as if realizing for the first time that he had lost control of his own physiology. He looked back up at me, his eyes pleading for an explanation that his arrogant mind could not comprehend. "True capability does not need to announce itself," I said, stepping closer to him. "It does not need to belittle others to feel powerful. It simply waits in the dark, perfectly still, until it is required." I looked at his terrified, bleeding face. "Stay in this room, Gareth," I commanded. "If you step out into that hallway, you will die, and I will not be there to clean up the mess." I turned and walked out of the lounge, leaving him alone in the dark with his shattered worldview. I reached the heavy double doors of the main surgical suite. The doors were locked from the inside, secured by a heavy magnetic seal. I pressed my ear against the cold steel. I could hear the faint, rhythmic beeping of a surgical monitor. I could hear the low, urgent voices of Kale and Darius. They were prepping Victor for the extraction. I stepped back from the doors. I looked up at the ceiling. The surgical suite was supplied by a complex network of medical gas lines routed through the interstitial space above the drop ceiling. Oxygen, nitrous oxide, sevoflurane. I holstered the pistol. I reached up and pushed one of the acoustic ceiling tiles aside. I pulled myself up into the dark, cramped crawl space above the corridor. The space was a tangled web of heavy ventilation ducts, electrical conduits, and pressurized copper pipes. I moved slowly, crawling on my stomach over the reinforced support beams, navigating by the faint light of my tactical penlight. I found the primary manifold for the surgical suite. It was a heavy brass junction box where the main gas lines split and descended into the operating room below. I located the line for the sevoflurane. It was a potent, highly volatile inhalation anesthetic used for deep surgical sedation. I pulled a heavy titanium wrench from my pocket. I clamped it onto the primary pressure valve and applied a slow, steady torque. The valve groaned, resisting the pressure. I adjusted my grip, locking my shoulder, and pulled with a sudden, violent burst of kinetic force. The brass fitting cracked. A high-pitched hiss filled the crawl space as the pressurized anesthetic gas began to leak rapidly from the pipe. I did not break the line completely. I created a localized, high-pressure leak directly above the primary ventilation intake for the surgical suite. The heavy, sweet-smelling gas was immediately sucked into the ductwork and pumped directly into the sealed operating room below. I held my breath, closing my eyes to protect them from the volatile vapor. I crawled backward, moving quickly away from the manifold, until I reached the access panel above the corridor. I dropped down onto the epoxy floor, landing silently in a low crouch. I waited. I counted the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. Sevoflurane is heavier than air. It would sink to the floor of the surgical suite, filling the room from the ground up. In a high concentration, it causes rapid disorientation, loss of motor control, and profound sedation. At 45 seconds, I heard a heavy crash from inside the suite, the sound of a metal tray hitting the floor. At 60 seconds, I heard Kale cursing loudly, his voice slurred and confused. It was time. I drew the suppressed pistol. I stepped up to the electronic keypad next to the double doors. I did not bother trying to hack the lock. I simply aimed the pistol at the heavy magnetic relay above the door frame and fired 2 rapid shots. The heavy caliber rounds shattered the housing, destroying the electromagnet. I kicked the doors open and stepped into the surgical suite. The room was a scene of chaotic, slow-motion horror. The bright, blinding surgical lights were angled down onto the central operating table. Victor was lying on the table. His chest was painted with dark brown iodine. A sterile surgical drape was positioned over his abdomen. He was heavily sedated, completely unaware of the nightmare unfolding around him. Helena, the lead transplant surgeon, was standing beside the table. She was holding a surgical scalpel, her hands trembling. She was wearing a sterile gown and a mask, but her eyes were wide with absolute terror. Darius was standing behind her. He was wearing his bespoke charcoal suit, completely out of place in the sterile environment. He was holding a small silver revolver, the barrel pressed firmly against the base of Helena's spine. "Operate, Dr. Rowan," Darius was saying, his voice tight with a desperate manic energy. "Make the incision. The buyer is waiting." But Darius was swaying on his feet. His eyes were glassy, his movements sluggish. The anesthetic gas was taking effect. Kale was standing near the heavy medical supply cabinets. He had realized what was happening. He was trying to pull a heavy tactical respirator over his face, but his fingers were clumsy, his motor skills degrading rapidly from the heavy concentration of sevoflurane in the air. He looked up as I kicked the doors open. He saw me standing in the doorway, the suppressed pistol raised and locked onto his center of mass. He did not hesitate. He dropped the respirator and lunged for the heavy tactical rifle slung across his back. I fired. The suppressed shot hit him in the right shoulder, shattering his collarbone. The kinetic impact spun him backward, slamming him into the stainless steel cabinets. But KL was a monster forged in the fires of private warfare. He did not go down. He roared, a primal sound of pure rage, and charged at me, ignoring the shattered bone. I knew the pistol would not stop him in time. I dropped the weapon, letting it clatter to the floor, and stepped fully into the room, preparing for close-quarters combat. Kale closed the distance in a fraction of a second. He swung his massive left fist in a brutal, sweeping arc aimed at my head. I ducked beneath the blow, feeling the wind of his fist brush against my hair. I stepped inside his guard, driving a heavy knee strike directly into his solar plexus. The blow landed with a sickening thud, but Kale barely flinched. He wrapped his massive arms around my waist, lifting me off the floor, and slammed me backward into the heavy surgical table. The impact drove the breath from my lungs. The edge of the steel table bruised my spine. Kale pinned me against the metal, his heavy forearm pressing down against my throat. He was trying to crush my windpipe. His face was inches from mine, his eyes burning with a violent, murderous intent. "You are dead, little nurse," he hissed, his breath smelling of stale coffee and copper. I could not breathe. The edges of my vision began to darken, a creeping black tunnel closing in around me. The heavy anesthetic gas in the room was making my head spin. I needed a weapon. I reached out blindly with my right hand, my fingers scrambling across the sterile surgical tray resting on the edge of the table. My hand closed around the heavy, textured grip of a surgical bone saw. It was a manual oscillating saw, designed for cutting through the heavy sternum during open-heart surgery. It was heavy, dense, and incredibly sharp. I did not try to cut him. I used it as a tactical lever. I brought the heavy steel housing of the saw up, driving the blunt edge directly into the radial nerve on the inside of Kale's forearm. The nerve strike was flawless. The intense, localized pain caused his muscles to involuntarily spasm. His grip on my throat loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all I needed. I twisted my hips, breaking his hold, and slipped out from under his arm. I pivoted on my heel, grabbing his wrist with both hands, and applied a brutal, tactical joint lock. I twisted his arm backward, hyperextending the elbow joint past its natural limit. Kale screamed as the ligaments tore with a wet, heavy popping sound. I did not stop. I stepped behind him, sweeping my leg behind his knee, and drove him face first into the hard epoxy floor. I dropped my weight onto his back, driving my knee directly into his spine, pinning him to the ground. I kept the pressure on his shattered arm, ensuring he could not move. The fight was over. I looked up, my chest heaving, pulling the heavy, sweet-smelling air into my lungs. Darius was standing by the operating table. The silver revolver had slipped from his fingers. The heavy concentration of sevoflurane had finally overwhelmed his system. He was staring at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending, his charismatic facade completely shattered. He took one unsteady step forward, his knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. Helena stood frozen by the table. She looked at Kale, pinned beneath my knee, his arm twisted at a grotesque angle. She looked at Darius, unconscious on the floor, and then she looked at me. She looked at my hands. They were perfectly, unnervingly steady, holding the heavy bone saw with absolute, lethal precision. "You," Helena whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" "I am the auditor, Dr. Rowan," I said, my voice calm and unhurried. "And this clinic is officially closed." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a heavy industrial zip tie. I secured Kale's wrists behind his back, pulling the plastic tight until it bit into his skin. I did the same to Darius. I stood up, dropping the bone saw onto the sterile tray. I walked over to the heavy ventilation control panel on the wall and engaged the emergency exhaust fans. The heavy, sweet smell of the anesthetic gas began to clear from the room, replaced by the cold, sterile air of the clinic. I walked over to Victor. He was still deeply sedated, his vitals steady on the surgical monitor. The iodine on his chest was drying, a dark stain on his pale skin. He was safe. The harvest had been interrupted. I looked at Helena. She was still staring at me, her mind struggling to process the extreme violence she had just witnessed. "Dr. Rowan," I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm, "I need you to monitor Victor's vitals. The authorities will be here shortly. You are safe now." She nodded slowly, the shock beginning to wear off, replaced by the deep, ingrained instincts of a medical professional. She turned her attention back to the patient, checking his pulse and adjusting the oxygen flow. I walked out of the surgical suite and into the red-lit corridor. The storm outside was beginning to break. The howling wind had dropped to a low, mournful moan. The heavy horizontal rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. Through the reinforced windows at the end of the hallway, I saw the first flashes of light cutting through the darkness over the Atlantic. They were not the running lights of a midnight charter helicopter. They were the heavy, sweeping searchlights of Coast Guard cutter vessels. The encrypted microbursts I had sent through the modified EKG machine had reached their target. Interpol had coordinated with the domestic authorities. The tactical units were breaching the island. I walked down the main corridor, the sound of heavy boots, and shouted commands echoing from the receiving bay. The facility was being secured. The corrupt network was being dismantled. Silas, Kyle, Darius, they were all going to face the absolute, crushing weight of international law. I reached the doctor's lounge. Gareth was still sitting on the floor, exactly where I had left him. He looked up as I entered the room. The arrogant, elitist concierge physician was gone. He was just a broken, terrified man. He looked at my steady hands, and then up at my face. "How?" Gareth whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "How did you do it? How did you survive the humiliation, the abuse? How did you let me speak to you like that, knowing what you were capable of?" I stopped in the doorway. I looked at him, feeling the cold, pristine silence of the clinic settling around us. "Because my ego is not tied to your perception of me, Gareth," I said. My voice was quiet, carrying the deep, hidden strength of 1,000 silent victories. "I do not need you to fear me to know that I am dangerous. I do not need you to respect me to know my own worth. You wear your arrogance like a shield because you are terrified of the world. I wear my weakness like a cloak, because I am the thing the world is terrified of." I turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the dark. I walked out the main doors of the clinic and onto the granite cliffs. The storm had passed, leaving the air cold, crisp, and smelling of ozone and salt. The heavy Coast Guard vessels were docked at the private pier, their searchlights sweeping across the jagged rocks. I stood on the edge of the cliff, looking out at the dark, churning water of the Atlantic. I raised my right hand. I held it out in front of me, silhouetted against the sweeping lights of the tactical teams. It was perfectly, flawlessly still. Not a single tremor, not a single vibration. The biological metronome was silent. The disguise was discarded. The mission was complete. I lowered my hand, turned my back on the island, and walked toward the extraction point, ready for whatever came next.